Hello and welcome to today's webinar, You've Been Breached, Now What? I'm Kristen Zurovich and I'll be your moderator for the webcast. But before we get started, I'd like to share just a couple housekeeping items with you. First of all, participation in this webinar may actually qualify you for CPE credits. So if you'd like a certificate of completion, simply email us at info@infosecinstitute.com and we'd be happy to send you one later today or this week. Since CPE requirements may vary by certifying bodies, please be sure to research the requirements before submitting for your credits. Also, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode, but we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. So feel free to submit those questions at any time using that questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be queuing these up and I'll share them with our guest speaker during the webinar and at the end of the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many as time permits today. With that, I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker, Keatron Evans. Keatron is managing partner at KM Cybersecurity. He is regularly engaged in training, consulting, penetration testing, and incident response for government, Fortune 500, and small business. In addition to being the lead author of the best-selling book, Chained Exploits, Advanced Hacking Attacks from Start to Finish, you will regularly see Keatron on major news outlets like CNN, Fox News, and others as a featured analyst talking about cybersecurity events and issues. For years, Keatron has worked regularly as both an employee and a consultant for several intelligence community organizations on breaches and offensive cybersecurity and attack development. He also provides world-class training for the top training organizations in the industry. Welcome to the webinar, Keatron.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Glad to be here. So, and thank you all for attending today too, taking time out of your busy schedule. So I'd like to kind of just jump right into, what we'll be looking at today. Part of that, we'll be looking at the security threatscape currently, why you need an incident response plan, a 6-step guide to incident response, and then talk about a communication plan creation, because that's one of the areas we see lacking in a lot of incident response plans these days. So is anyone immune to a breach? And if you look at just the threatscape currently and what's happened, let's just take the last year. It's pretty easy to come to the conclusion that no one's immune to a breach. If you look at this list here, these are quite mature security programs that a lot of these companies have. Verizon even produces the most trusted data breach report, the Verizon annual data breach report. We all refer to that in our presentations, in our studies, in our research, and in everything else that we do related to incident response. But as you can see, they were subject to, a breach as well. And then just before that, Yahoo actually had a pretty significant breach, and it actually knocked about $250 million off of the price that Verizon actually paid for Yahoo. So if you just look at that really quickly, you had Verizon that basically paid $250 million less than they were going to pay because Yahoo had a breach, and then months later Verizon had a breach. So it's that's kind of like the classic epitome of proving that no one's immune to these breaches. Now, why do you need an incident response plan? Basically, if you look at what goes on, I'm just going to, kind of break from the slide here just a little bit and tell you an example of what I've seen. So for one, you need an incident response plan because it'll help you identify what an actual incident is. One of the biggest messes I've ever walked into was a medium-sized organization that was literally taking every small incident and trying to run it through the gambit of a full-on incident response procedure. So, someone clicks on an email that looks like it might be suspicious, you got a whole incident response team responding to that. So what ended up happening is, after about 6 months of that, they told me that their entire security team was running around like chickens with their heads cut off because every little incident required them to put out this full-out response. And what that meant is they didn't really have an incident response plan. They had something written down, but it wasn't an actual plan. So you need that plan to help you even identify what an incident is, what qualifies as an incident, and then what's the appropriate response based on the severity and the distribution level of that incident. So that's kind of like the framework of why you need an incident response plan. In addition to that, the things we have listed here, you're probably under some type of legal requirement or some, statutory requirement that you have to have some type of plan. You can reduce recovery time, mitigate financial loss, support forensics investigations. A lot of times forensics investigations are actually thwarted because of poor incident response, and then increases the chances of successful insurance claims. And I want to just kind of make a point about the insurance claims. So a lot of insurance organizations actually require that you have a incident response plan before they will even cover you. And I recently spoke at a pretty big security conference in Chicago, and there was actually quite a few firms there touting themselves as incident response and breach firms, where they were kind of putting themselves or positioning themselves as, look, we're a traditional insurance firm, but we're kind of trying to set ourselves aside as specializing in insurance for breaches, for data breaches, so that, we can kind of handle that for you. But, we do want you to have a solid incident response plan. And we don't really know what a solid incident response plan is, but we got Keatron here to kind of help us tell if it's a solid plan or not. So I actually made some good connections, got a decent amount of business, from some of these insurance firms that will literally call us up and say, look, we need you to help us decide if this company that we're covering actually has a good incident response procedure and plan in place. So you can't underestimate the value of it. And what will end up happening is more and more, for you to be legally covered, for you to be covered in the case of a loss, like with an insurance policy, they're going to want to see that and make sure that you have something solid. And it won't just be paper. They'll have somebody behind the scenes kind of, attuned to what's going on to be able to say if it's good or not. Okay. Now, before you begin, you should have a good shell incident response communication plan, but you should be flexible and basically look at the questions that we have here and decide what to do based on that. So first of all, is the breach controlled? What was the time to detect period? Was the infrastructure damaged? What information was compromised? And was the evidence properly preserved? Now, one of the questions that would usually come up now is, well, where do we get the shell? How do we create it? You can go to the NIST website. They have, NIST 800-61 version 2, I believe, is the most recent version. That is an incident response framework. So what that means is you can go and get that and use it as guidance to which you will build your incident response plan from. Now, understand it's just a framework, because one of the most embarrassing things I've ever walked into is I went and told the firm, hey, you guys need to actually go and get the NIST document and use it to build an incident response plan. So I guess a year later they had an incident and they called me in to assist with it. And I said, well, where's your incident response plan? What they proceeded to produce for me was they gave me the NIST framework. And I said, wait a minute, this is just a framework. Where's your actual plan? It was like, well, you told us to use this. And it dawned on me that I wasn't exactly clear on, look, NIST is just a framework. And then from that framework, you need to build a plan. So I'm broadcasting it out to everybody listening now. Go to NIST, but use that as just your framework to build a plan. It by itself can't be an incident response plan. Okay. And a big section of that is talking about the communications, how you communicate, who you need to communicate with, and who needs to be included. Because you can't just, throw everybody in the kitchen sink in that list of trusted people that you communicate with, because then you really don't have control over the information flow. But at the same time, it's critical to have people like someone representing legal, someone representing HR, more recently, someone representing PR, because your PR people are going to need to be the ones to communicate, to your customers, to everybody else, what the incident is, how you're handling it, and all those things. And these people are actually trained in that. Even though we might be the technical experts, we're not expert when it comes to talking to media and stuff like that. So you need to make sure you have all the right people included in your communication plan. Now, as far as creating the communication plan, you need to, first of all, develop your internal contact roster. And believe it or not, as solid as you might think this is in a lot of companies, it's not really. We have lists of people that work there, but what their roles are, how they're able to help out as far as an incident, that stuff is always not apparent. And it's really not satisfactory to just go through an exercise of plugging people's names in and then never going through and actually testing this process out to see if these are the right people to be included. Sometimes I've seen incident response communication plans that simply list roles. So instead of listing individual contact people, they'll list the role. And that looks good on paper and it kind of gives you some cushion. But you know, what happens if you don't know who to call? You can't just say, oh, well, I want to call someone in HR, because now you might be 30 minutes getting to the right person. So what you really want to do is try to drill down into it and make sure that you have individual contacts in that communication plan and not just the roles. Maybe start with the role. It's kind of like your rough draft, but as you start to mature it, you want to definitely have individuals in there, and you need to revisit this thing and update it frequently, because employee roles change, employees move on to different companies, and you don't want to have an incident response communication plan whereas half the people on that plan don't even work there anymore. I've seen that happen a few times as well. So make sure you're able to identify key stakeholders, internal and external. You know, when you build your communication plan, you want to make sure that you have key people listed. I can candidly tell you here that I know for a fact that I'm on that list of you know, key stakeholders for incident response plans for several different companies. You know, some of them I've never been an employee of, but I'm one of the external stakeholders. So what I'm saying is you have to make sure that when you create your communication plan, you leave some room and take consideration for people that might not be an internal part of your organization. Because for most companies, regardless of the size, you're going to find that there's going to be some external entities that you need to include for you to actually have an effective incident response communication plan. Make sure you develop messaging for each group. Practice your plan. In other words, you need to go through tabletops and actually drill it. You know, go through it and see if you're going to be able to get to the people you need to in a timely manner. And if not, you might need to go back and adjust it, you know, to include somebody else there. Maybe the person that you like in that role that would be awesome at that role is never available. So you might have to put someone in that role that's not as ideal as the first choice, but maybe they have a lot more availability. These are internal decisions that you have to make. But what I'm saying is just make sure that you actually practice this so that you can make those decisions. And then, of course, that ties into measuring the effectiveness. You know, really an incident response plan should always be going through the process of being ran through. Then at the end of that process, you measure the effectiveness of it. And there should always be a lessons learned that should feed right back into the beginning that actually allows you to constantly improve it, to kind of narrow it down and get it more focused. All right. So sorry about that. So if you don't already have an incident response hotline, you need to create one. You know, make sure you include the basics like help desk, intrusion detection, admins, and people like that, because I found that a lot of times when you go in, you might think that just talking to security guys are the only people you need to talk to on the technical side. But to be quite honest with you, sometimes asking for specific log files from specific devices, you'll get a much faster answer and response from you know, someone else, maybe like an IT admin or something like that. So these things kind of need to be mapped out ahead of time and make sure you're communicating with the right people. All right, so as far as outside contractors, you know, if applicable, you want to include them as well, because they are just as important. So as far as your communication team, keep in mind what we're showing you here. This is not a authoritative, including everything type of list here. This is just kind of your basic list that you need to make sure you start with. Now, you definitely need to have a team leader, which is responsible for the overall response, will coordinate the necessary actions that need to take place. Ideally, this person will have great communication skills. They'll also be able to get into the technical weeds if they need to. So you probably want someone that has a pretty strong technical background, that's kind of climbed the ranks into maybe management, and they have great communication and management skills. That's what it requires to be a good team lead for an incident. You will also have an incident lead, which is basically the person that coordinates the actual response. Maybe they're not dealing so much with the communications to other people, HR, legal, upper management, et cetera, but they're definitely the most involved with the actual technical team that's actually doing the work. There's an IT contact, communicates with the incident lead and members of the IT staff. Because what we're finding as more organizations mature, we used to kind of traditionally think of IT and security as kind of one group, but now it's very clear line drawn in most mature organizations. You have security and then you have IT, and they're not the same. So you definitely need to make sure that you have a representative from IT and a separate representative from security. There should be a legal representative. This leads to the legal aspect of responding to the incident. When it gets into things like inappropriate content, child exploitation, any type of illegal content, you definitely want to make sure that you have a legal representative on board. Even things like seizing someone's computer, asking someone to leave their computer, singling them out, how do you even approach that? If you think that for some reason you have a content filter that tells you Keatron's looking at inappropriate material, and you go there and you validate that, even down to the way that you validate. You come to my computer and say, step away from your computer, let me see it, get away, don't touch it. Just how you do that could get you into legal trouble. So you need to make sure that you absolutely have a legal representative to even walk you through what the proper legal procedure is for notifying an individual that they're suspected of something, or even if you should notify them. These are not IT security decisions. These are legal decisions that need to be made, and you need to make sure you have legal representation to help you make that decision in the best way. Also, a PR officer, which is responsible for protecting and promoting the brand, and they need to be involved because it's hard for them to do that if breaches are happening and they don't know about it. There's also the management team, which approves and directs security policy during incident response. Several reasons you want to have management involved. One is they're the ones that can approve or disapprove things. They can, allow you to implement new things that need to be done, on the fly. Kind of, they have the final say so and the final authority. And generally speaking, if you are doing it the right way, all security policies should basically trickle down from upper management. So they should be heavily involved in creating the policy, and having them have great visibility into these incidents will allow them to be better policy makers. You can't have your management team not involved in incidents at all and then complain and say later, well, our security policies are terrible, our incident response policies are terrible, because the things that upper management sends down just don't make sense. Well, it's likely that they're sending down things that don't make sense because they're only listening to stuff that they hear in the news and they see on TV about Equifax and about Verizon, et cetera, and they're overreacting to that. So they're pushing down things that seem to be ridiculous to you guys in the trenches. And a lot of times that's because you have not done a good job of bringing them into that communication plan and bringing them into that communication circle when these breaches actually happen. I can't even count how many times I've seen that be the case. Now, who is impacted by the incident and how? There's external stakeholders and there's internal stakeholders, and we kind of have a list here of who those people are. Now, things like when to get law enforcement involved, how to get law enforcement involved, these are all internal decisions that have to be made. Now, there's going to be some legal oversight that says if you see certain things, you're required to communicate to law enforcement. But let me explain something to you. Even with that legal oversight and that regulation, it's still essentially going to be up to upper management and people inside the organization to decide when that actually happens. Now, one specific example, let me explain to you why that comes up. There was once an incident that I went and helped an organization respond to, and they were having trouble figuring out what was going on because all of the outbound communications, to this threat actor was encrypted. And it was basic XOR encryption. It was nothing big, like nothing that we couldn't break. So they gave us a task of taking all the traffic that their SIMs and their other network forensics devices had captured, and we were given the task of decrypting these packets and giving them unencrypted PCAPs so that they could then investigate. So once we started that process, after about 2 days in, one of the upper managers, the CISO, came to us and said, look, we want you guys to not decrypt this stuff anymore for now. We're going to put you on another project related to this incident for now, and then we'll come back to you later and let you finish decrypting. And what I later found out is the reason they did that was because they knew that we were going to find evidence of customer data being exfiltrated and that type of thing. And they were kind of trying to hold us off from revealing that, because once that was revealed, based on their regulations and the laws affecting, that particular company, they had to disclose that breach. They had to notify the customers that their information was touched. So I later went on to find out that the reason they kind of held us back on that was they wanted to give HR and PR and legal time to come up with how they were going to respond to it before we came out and said, hey, customer data is impacted. Now, if you look at that from an ethical standpoint, I don't necessarily agree with it. But at the same time, when this happened, we didn't know what the reasoning was. I found out kind of after the fact. But see, these are things that if you have a good plan and you know who the stakeholders are and what matters up front, you won't find yourselves in situations like that where you have to start trying to skirt ethical lines to keep yourself from losing a ton of money. So that's kind of how, that's an example I like to use to show people why you need to think about all these things and get them out there up front. So the stakeholders, clients, what data was compromised, who's affected, also you can add to that, when do you need to notify them? There's investors and directors, has the attack been stopped? What's your PR plan? I can remember once where this incident response lead person was communicating to the investors and directors that an incident was contained, when in actuality it wasn't contained, and it was all in his wording. He had contained it on one server, but the way the message got up to the upper management was the whole incident was contained. So they were moving forward with their PR plan and all this stuff and deciding what to do with the assumption that the incident was contained, and it was absolutely not contained. And it took me coming in, or us coming in from the outside, to just kind of take a look and say, wait a minute, this is not actually contained. Like, this one infected server is taken offline, but that hasn't contained the incident. And it was just a big mess. It ended up, they had to roll back a lot of announcements they were about to make. They had spent some money on some things. They had to try to get that money back for. So it was an ugly situation, and it was not a good month for that CISO either. So having, this plan proper and making sure you communicate things upstream and downstream the right way is probably one of the most important parts in messaging. Okay. There's going to be regulatory bodies that you have to inform. You want to make sure the messaging is right for them. Don't reveal too much, information about the internal workings and things like that. They're very clear, these regulatory bodies, on what it is they need to know about. Okay. As far as forensics teams, what was the point of the origin? What was the extent of the attack? What was the intent? They're going to want to know these things, because that will a lot of times shape the forensics investigation. And then, of course, media and PR. Who is the attacker? When did it happen? How can we message this to give it to the public to where it minimizes the impact that it'll have on our bottom line? And that's really what your PR people are for there.
Hey, Keatron, I
Sure.
have a question from Tim. So obviously, being someone who's been involved in addressing incidents response for a variety of clients, he wants to know, when you get to an organization to help them respond to a breach, what's typically the first thing that you do, or what's the first action you recommend?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And you know what? That answer has evolved. If you'd asked me that 5 years ago, my answer would be completely different than what I'm going to tell you now. So, but what I can tell you is the very first thing that I do when I walk in the door is I ask, where's the incident response plan and procedure documents? Like, where's your incident response stuff? What's your security policy? I need access to all those things, because here's why. Number one, if they have a good incident response policy and a good security policy, you're going to save yourself a lot of groundwork. Number two, You want to make sure as the outside expert, you're not coming in and advising them to do things, or you yourself do things that go to the left of what their incident response policy and procedure and security policy say. For example, it's easy for me to come in and do heroics and pretend, and be like, oh, I know everything. Let's just do it this way. But now I'm intentionally violating or going against what their approved policies are. And keep in mind, if it's an approved policy, that means it should have been approved by upper management. Their incident response plan should have been approved by upper management. So you're intentionally negating what's been approved by upper management. And let me tell you, that's never a good thing, ever. So one of the first thing that I do is I ask for those documents so that I can make sure that whatever plan I put into place is going to fit within the framework of what they've actually approved as their incident response policy and procedure document. Now, if I decide that there's things that are critical that need to be done that don't fit within that framework, then there's a proper channel that I go through to get that exception. I'll actually say, hey, Mr. or Ms. or CISO, I need you to go and get your upper management to sign off on me doing this, because this is the opposite of what your policy says, but this is absolutely what needs to happen. And if their communication plan and all that stuff is right, it won't take long to get that permission to do that. I'm not comfortable going in anymore, just, doing heroics. Heroics get you in trouble. Policy and procedure has you coming out looking a lot better in the end. So the first thing I do is that. And then secondly, I'll even give you a bonus here. The second thing that I do is I start to kind of assemble a team. Sometimes that team is made up entirely of my people. Sometimes that team is made up of a combination of my people and their people. But I kind of try to get the technical skills laid out, who can do what, and I'll build a team around that. And that allows me to get back to the CISO or the CEO pretty quickly with, like, look, here's what it's going to cost. For every 24 hours, you're going to be spending this much because I'm going to need this many of my guys in. On your side, it's going to cost you this much from your people because I'm going to need this person, this person, this person involved in this, and someone to replace them after 12-hour, 8-hour shifts, whatever we decide it is. So that's kind of my first two things, is ascertain what the incident response policy and procedures are. And if they don't have any, then you know what? I have standard incident response policies and procedures that I can work from, that I usually have on hand with me. And then secondly, I start to ascertain what the talent pool is that I'm going to have to work with. So those are my top two. And there's actually a list of 10 things that I always do in the beginning, but we can talk about that offline or something. Was there any more, Kristen, or you want to keep going now?
Let's keep going, and we'll see as more come in, and
okay, cool.
We'll field those during the event.
All right, thank you. So, and that actually lines right up to what this next piece of the slide is here. It says technical skills and data requirements. So, memory, network, dead drive forensics, these skills are all going to be required, because you can't possibly know which one. So what I say is, look, we need somebody that can do memory forensics, network forensics, and hard drive forensics. Do you have anybody in your team that can do these things? And if the answer is either no, we don't, or we don't know, then I immediately start to pull in people that can do these things, because they're absolutely going to be required. Now, you generally find that most organizations have a capability of doing hard drive forensics, and less organizations have the internal ability to do proper memory and network forensics, because there is some pretty specialized areas, and it takes quite a bit of experience to be, even decent at it. We need people with penetration, exploitation, and hacking expertise, simply because, when you talk about a breach, you're usually investigating a situation where someone's actually done these things. And you need someone that understands what this process is, what hacking looks like, what exploitation looks like, to help you investigate it. And that's kind of why we, how we justify that. Documentation of infrastructure is a biggie. And this is, unfortunately, one of the bigger problems that I've seen over and over again. We go into places and I'll say things like, hey, IT security, can you give me a map of all your inbound and outbound points? Every point that traffic's allowed in, egress and ingress, I need to see a map of all those, because if we're trying to stop exfiltration, we need to know where things can be exfiltrated through. And amazingly, most of the time, they don't have that documentation handy. And even when they have it, it's not exactly accurate, because we end up finding, data exit points and data entry points that weren't documented. And, there's plenty of blame to go around in that. What I see a lot of times is you see the IT people, the security people saying, okay, IT people, give us a map of the whole infrastructure of the environment. And then IT can't produce it immediately. So then you have security people saying, well, you guys should have been able to produce this instantly. And then you have the IT people saying, well, if you guys are securing the environment, why are you just now asking for it? Like, how can you secure an environment if you're only asking for documentation about the environment when there's a breach? So both sides have a valid argument there. IT security should have asked about the documentation of the infrastructure long before there's an actual breach. And IT should have the ability to put their hands on that or create that documentation pretty quickly. Okay. I've actually went into big organizations where part of the process that we had to unfortunately do is we actually had to help them document what their infrastructure is. We actually had to bring in some people to do scanning and stuff like that to just identify where things were, because even though on paper they said they knew, when you actually start to dig into it, sometimes you find out they don't know. It's just literally as black and white as that. And one of the things that I try to bring to the table when I come into an organization is, look, like, don't be embarrassed by this. Like, what I'm telling you is, like, you're not the exception here because you don't have good mappings of your infrastructure. This isn't quite common. So don't feel like you're like, in a terrible place here. This is a common thing. But you know what? Let's not judge. Let's not try to compare. Let's just find out what the flaws are. Let's fix them and move forward. And theoretically, the best case scenario is we get this incident contained in a minimal amount of time. And in the process of that, we make it less likely that that incident or an incident similar will happen again in the future. That's really the best you can hope for when you're managing these. And the technical skills are how you actually a big part of that. And if you don't have the skills internal, make sure you have someone available to, from the outside that can help you with that.
And related to that, Keatron, Carol actually posed a really good question here. She's asking, what skill sets should we try to invest money in and build internally, and which are more appropriate to consider contracting out as needed in the event that we need to save money?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. And you know what, I'm going to give you two answers to that. One is, the first and the easy answer is, it depends on the size of your organization, what your security budget is, how many incidents you have on an average month, or whatever the case may be. So that's the easy answer. The better answer and the more specific answer is, look, when you think about things like getting compromised and then infiltrated and someone planning malware, well, obviously you're going to need someone to be able to reverse engineer that malware to effectively say what it's doing and how it's doing it. Now, that's a classic example of, it's probably a skill set that you're better off contracting out. If you don't have 10 pieces of malware per month that you need someone to reverse engineer, you probably don't need to try to have an internal reverse engineer that's dedicated to just doing that. If you're getting breached that much and you got that much malware that you have someone to reverse engineer, there's a lot of other places you should be spending that money to bring that number of infections and compromises down. So, having someone that's an expert in reverse engineering is probably not something that most organizations should invest a ton in. If you're, let's say, a Fortune 50, okay, yeah, you should probably have a few of those guys. But if you're a medium-sized company, it's going to be hard for you to justify, paying someone 200 grand a year, to do reverse engineering when there's not that much reverse engineering to do. So I would start with making sure you have someone that's able to manage an incident. That would be like kind of a first starting point. And that could just be, one of your IT security people that get some management training on managing incidents. Because again, you can start at that point when you have an incident, subbing it out, bringing someone in to help you manage the technical side of it. And through that process, you should kind of learn what's required And then you can start to kind of try to break it down. All right, so Keatron came in, he bought in a reverser, he bought in a network forensics person, he bought in a person that does exploitation, he bought in a documentation person, and then he bought in a communications person. So it seems like that's kind of like his core people that he bring in. So now let me look at those people and see which of those people I can afford to bring in internally. And we do a good job of helping companies do that. Usually what I tell my customers is, look, if we help you with your first breach and we have to do everything, and then the second time you have a breach, we still have to do everything, then we didn't do a good job of helping you prepare. We didn't do a good job of knowledge transfer and things like that. So generally start with the minimal amount. Start with just maybe your IT security people or person that has enough skills to maybe manage an incident, and then allow them to bring in outside help, and then slowly do knowledge transfer that gives you time to build in a budget or bake in a budget just for that. That would be how I would approach it.
Good. Sam, Keatron, I have a couple other questions that are coming in on the outsourcing versus in-house side of things.
Sure.
Sam is asking, here you were talking about what types of skills, technical skills, could be outsourced versus internal. A few slides ago, you were actually talking about building your communication team. Do you see many situations in which people that are in the communication roles, not necessarily the technical roles, that those are filled by external consultants or contractors?
Yeah, I don't see that happening a lot. And part of that's because that person or those people that handle the communication, they're going to have direct access to a lot of very important, a lot of busy people. And you generally try to shield, those important, like, high ranking executives from a lot of outside interaction for a lot of reasons. So I don't see that happening a lot. Those communication roles are generally usually propagated by someone internal. And it doesn't have to be someone that's dedicated full time to doing that. It could literally just be, it might be someone from legal or someone from HR who has kind of a secondary job of being in charge of that communication process. And sometimes that it stays that way, and sometimes it evolves into now we hire a communications person that's full time just for that. And the reason I kind of phrase it that way is a lot of, I would say most medium-sized companies would have a hard time justifying paying a communications person a full-time salary. That would generally be something that they would sub out. But when it comes to incident response, that communication person is generally someone internal that may have another job that they do most of the time. And that communication or facilitating that communication might be part of their additional job responsibility.
Got it. I have a question that came in from Yash, and just to give you kind of where he's coming from, he says, ransomware attacks in many cases, cyber experts aren't always able to decrypt the files in case of newer ransomware threats. And he's wondering if you have any suggestion for ransomware incident response and its documentation, and how much money or how much that might cost and how much he should estimate for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough, to try to put a money figure on it would be tough, because it would really be I would have to look at the incidents that you're getting. But when you look at ransomware, a lot of times they, and I've actually seen this where organizations have just decided to pay the ransom, where they'll call me and say, hey, we got hit with ransomware. Here's what it is. Can you come out to take a look? And then I'll give them a quote for me to fly out to wherever and spend a day or 2 days looking at it. And they'll say, well, it's going to cost us, 10 grand for you to be here for 3 days and get out here. And these guys are only asking for $1,000. So we're just going to pay the ransom. Now that happens more often than you might think. So a lot of times, you can kind of come up with a formula for calculating how much you should spend on it based on what the cost of the ransom is and how frequently you have those. But again, you have to look back at the fact that most ransomware gets into organizations through some type of client-side attack where someone clicked on something or where a control was missing that they were able to get in based on that. So with that being said, it might be more, an additional thing to think about is how can you minimize the amount of ransomware infections you're getting. Because if you look at last year, the big ransomware attacks that happened last year, primarily the way that those ransomware attacks were propagated was through, the vulnerability that the NSA leaked, or the exploit that the NSA leaked. And that was actually the #1 way that last year's biggest ransomware attack was able to get so big so fast. And it turns out that Microsoft had released a patch for that Eternal Blue exploit months before the ransomware started to get propagated through it. So what it boiled down to is most organizations that were infected with it, it's because they were missing a patch that was 2 months old. So you kind of have to tie that into it and look at it from that perspective. But I mean, it's hard for me to give you an actual amount of money you should spend per ransomware attack without, really looking at what they're asking you for in ransom. I mean, if it's $100 for ransom, then, it would kind of be ridiculous for me to tell you don't spend less than 10 grand on handling that incident. I really think that that's a situation where you kind of need to establish in the beginning, what your policy is for responding to ransomware. Now, I do have some templates and things like that. If you get ransomware, here's what you do, kind of like a 10-step walkthrough that I give some of my customers. Sometimes they can handle it. Sometimes they can do like steps 1 through 6, but they'll need help with steps 7 through 10 type of thing. But I'm happy to at some point make that available to you guys so that you can build from that.
Good, thanks for that, Keatron. I think we may actually take you up on that offer, and for everyone that's registered for this webinar, we'll share a link to that if you want to share that with me later.
Sure.
Perfect. Good, and Riyash just confirmed that, thank you, he got his answer.
All right, cool.
So good job on that.
Yeah. All right, so, and I figured I would answer some more things because I'm sure there were some more questions that people might have had around it too, so I kind of tried to hit all of the possible ones there. So following a breach, NIST recommends appointing a single point of contact for media inquiries. Sometimes, that can be, again, an outside or an internal person, but keep in mind the communication will still be facilitated usually by someone internally. Now, creating media talking points that are approved by IT, legal, and PR is kind of what you want to do, because you don't want legal to put something in there that sounds so rigid or sounds so much like a denial or something like that, that to people in the public, they look at that as, okay, they're obviously in a lot of trouble just because of how that was worded. I mean, because we do need legal. That's an essential part of any communication to the outside world. But what happens sometimes is legal can get so caught up in protecting you legally that when the message gets out, it's obvious that you're hiding something or that you have a huge problem. So that's why you need things filtered through that PR group to kind of take that message and soften it, or make it to where it's not so obvious as to what's actually going on internally if you're not ready to disclose that information yet. So this is why you need all of these. And you also need IT involved, because sometimes legal and PR by themselves will release a message that sounds great legally and PR wise, but absolutely is impossible when you look at the technical implications of it. So you got to have all three of these guys talking and on the same page, and make sure the message is consistent, make sure it's factually accurate, and also make sure it minimizes the amount of damage to the brand. That's an important thing. So hold trainings for this, for media-facing employees, so they know how to deal with the media. Generally, the answer is, refer to someone designated to speak on behalf of the company to the media. That's usually like the blanket answer. Performing mock interviews and practicing messaging so that they know what to say. Saying things such as, I'm going to refer you to, such and such, who is our contact, our PR contact, to get an answer to that. Instead of saying, I'm not allowed to communicate or respond to that, so I'm going to refer you to the PR people. Like, that's a completely different message. When you say, I'm not allowed, that implicates that someone's behind you poking you saying, hey, you better not say this. And you don't want your people saying things like that. You want it to be just simply point blank, I'm going to refer you to PR, I'm going to refer you to legal. You don't want them saying, I'm not allowed, or things like that. And that sounds like something small, but trust me, it's huge when it comes to public perception. Okay. Now, practice makes preparedness. Make sure you go through the process of doing these tabletop exercises to where you go through your plan, because usually when you do that, you will find some obvious flaws that need to be addressed. Make sure you audit your contact roster so that you can actually reach these people. Make sure everyone knows their role, identify skills gaps, find solutions. Because trust me, any skill that you need to handle an incident, that skill is out there somewhere. You just have to go find it, and you want to find it before you actually need it. You don't want to be in the middle of an incident and be looking for someone to come in and do network forensics. Like, you want to already have a few people or organizations on standby for that. We have several pretty significant retainer agreements with some organizations where we basically say, look, if you have an incident, I will have someone communicate back to you within 4 hours from the time that you contact with us. And then secondly, within 24 hours, we'll have someone on site. We have different degrees of that. Some organizations have requested that we have a guaranteed, 24-hour on-site time, a guaranteed 2-hour response time. And sure, we can offer that. It just costs more. So there's ways to do that, even if you don't have it internally. And sometimes it might be worth you to spend the money just to bring somebody in like me or like Infosec to say, look, what skills do we need? Which ones do we have? Help us to shape this and figure out what we need to contract out and what we need to bring in. Because I went out to one company and they said, look, we don't have anybody capable of doing any of this. So come and help us hire people to build a team. And it turns out they were absolutely wrong. About 70% of the team that I put together for them were people internal. So they had the skills, they just didn't know it. They had a person that was a hacker by hobby that was very, very seasoned at reverse engineering stuff and understanding network traffic, but they had him in a desktop support role. So what I call that is a gross misuse of internal skills. But it took, me coming in, kind of taking control of the IT team and sending out messages saying, hey, I'm building a team that does this. Anybody have any of these skills, or anybody think they have these skills? Anyone interested? We're going to have a few meetings to assess these skills and see if anybody has them. And just people came out of the woodworks with amazing technical security skills that just weren't being utilized. And the person in charge flat out told me, like, look, we don't have anyone that can do this stuff. So a lot of times you just need to kind of rattle some cages, shake some trees a little bit, just to see what you got internally, because you might be wrong about that sometimes. And once you have that done, you can make a better plan. Okay. Make sure you measure results, adjust your plan, measure things like detection time, response time, how long systems were down, what it cost you legally, what it cost you PR-wise, what's the business impact. Hopefully you have business impact analysis capabilities baked in to your security policy and your risk management policies and things like that, because those numbers are going to be very valuable for you to kind of shape your plan going forward as far as what you should spend and things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Kristen, and I'll be happy to take more questions.
Sure, and we have a couple other questions that are rolling in. Keatron, I'd like to give folks maybe a minute yet to submit their final questions. And while you're doing that, I think it's very clear that security incidents are a way of IT life these days. And really how organizations respond to them is what makes a huge difference in how much damage is ultimately done. I just want to make everyone aware that Infosec Institute actually offers a hands-on incident response boot camp that covers the essential information needed to properly detect, contain, and mitigate security incidents. So this 5-day course helps you really understand how systems are compromised and what traces are left behind by attackers, either on the network, on the disks, or in volatile memory. And in this bootcamp, you'll actually learn all of the ins and outs of incident response, as well as tools and tricks of the trade used by incident responders like Keatron on a daily basis. The nice thing about the bootcamp is it also prepares any students for the CERT Computer Security Incident Handler exam, which is offered by Carnegie Mellon. As an enrolled student, your bootcamp actually covers or includes the CSIH practice questions. It includes the Infosec Institute Instant Response course book, a textbook, pre-study textbook, and all of the CSIH exam fees and registration are also covered. So it's a nice package if you do have individuals on your team that maybe you uncover as having some of those skills, but just need that extra step to be fully qualified to assist in future incident response addressing. This is a good option for them. If you are interested in learning more about the Incident Response Bootcamp, simply go to infosecinstitute.com/courses and check it out there. You'll find syllabus and pricing details and all of that good information. I do have a couple more questions that have come in. I have one here that is just asking, how important is it to know how the hacker breached the server?
Well, I think, how the hacker breached the server is important for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of times for you need to, and we generally call that root cause for the most part. And the reason that's important is, for one, it's hard for you to say that you contained it if you don't know, how the initial compromise actually came in. And it's also harder for you to, to say that you've done things now to prevent it from happening in the future. Companies have really gotten in a lot of trouble in the past for saying, hey, we found it, we contained it, it won't happen again. And then like a few days later, there's evidence that they're still breached. So there's a classic case of that, where a casino in Vegas was breached. They bought in one, and I'm not going to get into naming the incident response firms, but they bought in one IR firm, and that firm said, yep, everything's contained. We found the root cause. We nailed it down. We've got it handled. And then they were there for like a month, and then another firm came in behind them and said, wait a minute, it's not contained. You still got exfiltration happening right now. So it was a pretty nasty situation. And part of that was because they didn't put the right amount of effort into determining the root cause. So I would say that knowing how you got breached in the first place is very important, extremely important. And it should be a key part of your incident response, is putting some effort into that. Although you can't just say, spend a year trying to investigate and figure out, how you got compromised. After a certain amount of time, one or two things happens. One, you realize that whoever you got on it doesn't necessarily have the skills to come to that conclusion. Or B, you need to, just say, look, we've done our due diligence and due care. We've put in a significant amount or the right amount of time and effort into determining root cause. At this point, we haven't been able to do that, but we have been able to determine all the affected areas. We've been able to sanitize, contain those areas, and we will continue our investigation into root cause and see if anything happens again. At some point, you have to do that because what happens is otherwise you spend your entire security budget for the year on one incident. So root cause is extremely important. It's one of the most important things in the process of going through incident response, but you kind of have to be careful about not spending too much resources on that.
Very good. Here is a really interesting question from Megan. She's asking, what's the biggest gap that you see in organizations' capabilities for handling a real incident?
I think the biggest gap that I see, first of all, believe it or not, is one of the points I touched on earlier, is organizations have a severe deficiency in visibility, of the environment, understanding the environment, knowing what the environment is. And that sounds kind of elementary, but it's really not. Let's just take a big organization like Verizon or like Chase or like Target or any of these big companies that have been breached. If you were to say, what does their infrastructure look like? That's a big question. And to go in and say, I'd like an inventory of every device that's on your network, that's a hard question to answer. So I think that is one big gap, maybe even the biggest that I see, because when I go in and ask, what's the map of the organization look like? Were things possibly being exfiltrated through? We never get good answers to that initially. And it turns into an entire, sometimes multi-month, or even in a couple of cases, a multi-year project that spin off to where their job was to just go and basically inventory the environment, like they don't have a good inventory of the environment. And let me just tell you, if you don't have a good inventory of your environment, you're not going to be good at securing it, and you're not going to be good at responding to incidents that happen in said environment. I'll give you an example. In my house, there's 4 doors that can go in and out of the house. All right. If you task me with securing that house physically, and I only know about 2 of the 4 doors, how can you possibly expect me to secure it if there's doors that people can go in and out of that I don't even know exist? It's just not really possible, because someone could be coming in and out all day through doors that I don't even know about. And I might not even find out about it until they've taken half, my stuff out of my house. So with that same ideology, if you're telling me you have an IT environment that you don't have an inventory of, you don't have good visibility into, you don't know where things are, you don't have a footprint of what your applications look like. You have, I went into one organization and said, how many applications do you have? And they said, oh, we got about 300. And then we did an inventory and found out they had like 700. And out of the 700, they only knew about 500 of them. So there were 200 applications in the environment that nobody knew that they were there, and nobody knew what they were for. That's a problem, because every application, every device, every entry and exit point introduces a new opportunity for exploitation. And if you don't know about those opportunities for exploitation that I'm putting in quotes there, then you can't possibly secure it. And then you're going to have an even tougher time responding to an incident that happens in that environment. So I would gather to say that the biggest gap, and I think, maybe I would like to phrase it like this: the biggest and probably the most impactful gap is the fact that the visibility and the inventory of the environment is lacking. And I think if we button that down, a lot of the other things will fall into place more readily. Now, second to that, I always like to give, when someone asks me what's the biggest, I always like to say the second. The second thing is a shortage of skills, the shortage of technical skills. There's a ton of people that have went to classes and they know how to, on the surface, and from a management and soft side, they know how to manage incidents. But then getting into the weeds and actually doing the technical stuff, there's a huge shortage of that skill set. So those are like my number 1s and number 2s.
Fantastic. So it looks like we are approaching the top of the hour, and I do want to keep us in time today. Keatron is willing to share his, his contact information with you. If you have any additional questions for him, you'll find his contact information on the next screen. And for those of you that have asked whether this is being recorded, it has been recorded. So everyone that registered for today's webinar will receive a link to the recorded video as well. So if you need to refer back to the slides, those will be available to you. And as a bonus, we'll include that template that Keatron mentioned with the steps for handling ransomware. So thank you very much, Keatron, for today's webcast. Very, very insightful and very helpful based on the flurry of questions we got.
All right, thank you very much.
And we hope that we'll see you on a future webcast, everyone, and have a great day.